It was the late 1960s, and the San Francisco Bay Area gleamed under the golden Californian sun. Families strolled through the streets, teenagers laughed in parks, and couples found solace in quiet, secluded spots along the rugged coastlines. On the surface, life was calm, ordinary, almost blissfully safe. But beneath this calm, a shadow began to stir. A shadow that would soon leave an indelible mark on America's history. The first whispers of fear came quietly. On a cool summer night in December 1968, the serene town of Vallejo was shattered by a brutal crime. High school students and local couples who ventured out to enjoy the night found themselves walking into the path of a predator no one could anticipate. The first victims, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were just teenagers, innocently parked by a quiet stretch of road. That night, the killer struck without warning, shooting them both with cold precision. The small community awoke to horror. No one could fathom why someone would commit such violence. As police scoured the scene for clues, they found nothing that could point them to a motive. The killer had left almost no trace, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. It was as if he had vanished into the night itself. The locals were stunned, but the terror had only just begun. Within months, more attacks followed, each equally brutal and seemingly random. Couples in secluded areas, people walking alone at night, everyone became a potential target. The killer did not discriminate, and his unpredictability spread fear like wildfire across Northern California. Then came the letters. Newspapers began receiving cryptic messages, letters written in an unsettling combination of symbols, letters, and puzzles. One letter even boasted of the murders, claiming responsibility with a twisted sense of pride. The police were perplexed. How could someone commit such heinous acts and still feel the need to taunt them publicly? The Zodiac, as the letters would later identify him, was not just a murderer. He was a master manipulator, enjoying the terror he inflicted and the confusion he left behind. Residents began changing their routines. Couples stopped going to their usual spots. Teenagers avoided walking alone. Parents clutched their children tightly, afraid of a stranger lurking in the shadows. Shops posted warnings, and local newspapers ran headlines that grew increasingly sensational. The Zodiac was no longer just a killer. He had become a phantom in the collective imagination of the Bay Area. At the police headquarters, detectives worked around the clock. Each new letter was analyzed for handwriting, content, and potential clues. Cryptographers were consulted for the strange ciphers included in the letters. One cipher, a grid of letters and symbols, promised to reveal his identity if solved, a taunt that challenged both the authorities and the public alike. The FBI was contacted, but even federal agents were baffled. The Zodiac did not follow any predictable pattern, leaving each new crime scene eerily similar in its randomness, yet horrifying in its precision. Communities began to talk in hushed tones. "Did you hear what happened last night?" people whispered. Fear was now woven into the everyday fabric of life. The killer's methods were not just about the act of murder. They were about control, about creating panic, and he was succeeding. Ordinary people became vigilant, neighbors suspicious of one another. The Bay Area had changed overnight, but the changes were only the beginning of a long, terrifying chapter. One particularly chilling moment occurred when a couple reported being followed. As they drove down a dark, winding road, a car appeared in their rearview mirror, keeping pace with them. Panic surged through them as the realization dawned. They were not alone. Could it be the Zodiac? They survived that night, but the terror lingered, leaving an invisible mark on their psyche. Stories like these spread quickly, and the legend of the Zodiac grew even faster than the crimes themselves. Amidst the chaos, journalists played a crucial role in amplifying the fear. Every letter from the Zodiac, every new cipher was printed in newspapers across the state. The public, terrified yet fascinated, followed each development with morbid curiosity. Radio shows discussed the killings, talk of Zodiac became dinner table conversation, and fear infiltrated the psyche of a generation. The killer's fame, undesired though it was, began to cement his place in history. Yet for all the attention, the Zodiac remained invisible. Witnesses gave vague descriptions, each conflicting with the other. The letters hinted at a man clever, calculating, and confident, someone who enjoyed the game he was playing. Authorities tried to profile him, to predict his next move, but he seemed always one step ahead, a phantom moving silently through the streets, leaving only dread in his wake. By the end of 1969, the Bay Area was a community on edge. Parents insisted their children stay home at night. Couples abandoned their romantic spots they once frequented, and streets that were once lively at night became eerily empty. Every knock on the door, every shadow in the corner was met with suspicion. The Zodiac was not just a killer, he was a symbol of unpredictability, of the terror that could strike anyone, anywhere, without warning. The first part of this chilling story closes with a letter sent directly to the San Francisco Chronicle. It was unsigned but unmistakable. "I like killing people because it is so much fun," the letter read. The words were simple, yet the message was clear. The Zodiac's game had only just begun, and Northern California would never be the same again. This was the world the Zodiac had created, a place where ordinary life could be shattered in an instant, where fear lurked in every quiet street and every dark corner. The hunter was at large, the community terrified, and the authorities challenged like never before. And through it all, one question remained: who was the Zodiac, and how long would he continue his reign of terror? By early 1969, the Bay Area was no longer just a region of quiet suburbs and sunlit streets. It had become the hunting ground of an unseen terror, one that moved silently but struck with horrifying precision. The people of Northern California lived under a growing cloud of dread, a fear that infiltrated every aspect of their daily lives. And at the center of it all was the Zodiac, a killer who had realized that the true power of fear lay not only in murder, but in the messages left behind. It began with the letters. Newspapers across the state started receiving envelopes containing cryptic messages and puzzles, the handwriting meticulous, the words calculated. Each letter was a challenge to the authorities, a taunt that the police could not ignore. One of the earliest and most famous ciphers, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, was a complex jumble of letters and symbols, a riddle claiming to reveal the killer's identity, but decades would pass before anyone could even partially decode it. The content of these letters was chilling. In one note, the Zodiac boasted, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." Another claimed responsibility for murders that had yet to be discovered. In yet another, he threatened that if his letters were not printed in the newspapers, he would continue his spree unabated. The messages were short, precise, and terrifyingly direct, a mix of arrogance, intelligence, and sadistic delight. For the residents of the Bay Area, these letters were more than just words on paper. They were warnings. People became hyper-aware of their surroundings. Teenagers avoided walking home alone, couples abandoned their secret rendezvous spots, and parents kept their children inside after dark. Entire neighborhoods were paralyzed by fear. Every stranger became a potential threat, every shadow a possible danger. The Zodiac was not only killing, but he was rewriting the very way people lived. The police scrambled to respond. Every letter was scrutinized for clues, handwriting analyzed, paper examined for fingerprints, postmarks traced. Cryptographers were consulted to decode the ciphers, hoping to find a message that would reveal the killer's identity or his next move. One letter, filled with symbols arranged in a grid, suggested a mind brilliant yet deranged. Every time authorities thought they were close to solving a puzzle, another letter would arrive, mocking their efforts. It was as if the Zodiac was playing a game, a deadly chess match with the people of California. Newspapers played a pivotal role in this growing saga. The Chronicle, the Examiner, and other local publications printed his letters, aware that refusing to do so might provoke the killer further. But this also amplified the terror. Citizens could read his words for themselves, each sentence carefully crafted to unnerve, to provoke, and to instill fear. The letters became front-page news, and the public followed every development with morbid fascination. It was impossible to ignore. The Zodiac had captured the imagination of the Bay Area, not as a hero, but as a phantom whose presence loomed over every street corner. Amid this panic, small victories and false leads created a roller coaster of tension. Police occasionally identified potential suspects, but nothing ever held up. Eyewitnesses provided vague or conflicting descriptions. Tips poured in from the public, many of them unreliable or misleading. The Zodiac seemed untouchable. Each time law enforcement believed they were close, he struck again in a different location, proving that he was always one step ahead. The unpredictability of his attacks created an atmosphere of constant vigilance and deep paranoia. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on the public was profound. People whispered about the killer at dinner tables, discussing the cryptic letters and gruesome murders as if he were a specter haunting their homes. Parents instructed their children never to go out at night. Teenagers avoided secluded spots they had once frequented freely. Fear had become a daily companion, a silent predator stalking every citizen's life. The Zodiac had not only committed heinous acts of violence, he had succeeded in creating a climate of terror that extended far beyond the crime scenes. As the letters multiplied, so did his audacity. In one chilling instance, he demanded that his communication be printed, threatening further violence if ignored. In another, he taunted the police directly, describing his own actions in ways that seemed almost theatrical. He reveled in the public's terror, feeding on the notoriety that came with each new communication. The more they feared him, the more powerful he became. For detectives, the challenge was exhausting. They worked day and night, piecing together information from murders, near misses, and cryptic messages. Every new letter forced a re-examination of previous cases. Every new cipher presented another complex puzzle. Specialists in cryptography were consulted, yet the Zodiac's codes often seemed unbreakable, adding layers of frustration and dread to an already terrifying situation. The city itself became part of the investigation. Every street corner, every empty lot, every quiet park potentially holding the key to stopping the killer. The public, meanwhile, became obsessed with the mystery. Newspapers published his letters, true crime enthusiasts analyzed the ciphers, and ordinary citizens speculated endlessly on the Zodiac's identity. His legend began to grow faster than his body count. He was no longer just a criminal, he was a symbol of fear and fascination, a reminder that danger could lurk anywhere, unseen, unpredictable, and unstoppable. As the months progressed, each new letter, each new attack further entrenched the fear gripping the Bay Area. The Zodiac's psychological warfare was as deadly as his physical attacks. His letters conveyed a sense of omnipresence. He could strike anywhere, anytime, and he made sure that everyone knew it. Parents, teens, and law enforcement alike lived with the constant awareness that the next headline could report another senseless death. Part of the horror was the challenge the Zodiac presented, a game of intelligence, cruelty, and audacity. Each cipher was a riddle, each letter a clue, yet the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. People read the newspapers with a mix of fear and fascination, hoping for insight, dreading the next revelation. The city seemed paralyzed, trapped in a psychological maze built by a man who thrived on chaos. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac had become a legend in life as much as in fear. His ciphers remained mostly unsolved, his letters continued to taunt, and the public's anxiety had reached a peak. Northern California would never feel entirely safe again. People moved differently, lived differently, and thought differently, all because of one man whose identity remained a mystery, whose methods were unpredictable, and whose terror was far from over. The first phase of his campaign had been terrifying, but the Zodiac was only beginning to make his mark. The letters had proven that he was intelligent, cunning, and unafraid of scrutiny. He was both a killer and a storyteller, crafting his legend with each word and symbol he sent into the world. And as the Bay Area lived in terror, one question haunted everyone. How long would this ghost continue to haunt them, and who, if anyone, could stop him? By the early 1970s, the Zodiac Killer had transformed Northern California into a stage for fear and uncertainty. Communities that had once thrived on simple pleasures now lived in a shadow of suspicion. Every quiet street, every deserted parking lot, every dark alley was now a potential hunting ground. The police were desperate to stop him, yet the Zodiac seemed always one step ahead, a phantom who could vanish without a trace. The manhunt intensified. Detectives formed task forces, pulling in experts from local, state, and federal agencies. Every murder scene was meticulously analyzed. Patterns were scrutinized, suspects were tracked, and every tip was followed, no matter how minor. Yet for all the resources and hours spent, the Zodiac eluded capture. He struck sporadically, unpredictably, leaving authorities chasing shadows, haunted by the knowledge that he could strike again at any time. Public fear had reached a fever pitch. Parents forbade their children from walking alone. Teenagers avoided their favorite hangouts, and couples abandoned their quiet retreats. Every story of someone being stalked or attacked spread quickly, each adding to the growing legend of the Zodiac. Citizens carried this fear into their everyday lives, questioning every stranger, every sound, every movement in the dark. The killer's influence extended far beyond his crimes. He had rewritten the psychological landscape of the Bay Area. In the midst of this chaos, minor suspects emerged and faded into obscurity. A local man was arrested after being linked to a letter, only to be released when alibis held. Another suspect was followed for weeks, yet the Zodiac struck elsewhere, leaving investigators frustrated and humiliated. Each failed lead heightened tension and deepened the public's dread. People began to understand that this was no ordinary criminal. This was a predator playing a game that no one could win. Eyewitness accounts added layers of horror. Survivors spoke of close encounters, of cars that appeared in rearview mirrors, of footsteps in the shadows, of the sudden, terrifying presence of a man who seemed to materialize from nowhere. One teenager recounted a parking lot encounter that left her frozen with fear, heart pounding, convinced that her life had nearly ended in the hands of the Zodiac. These stories spread quickly, each account adding more texture to the legend, and each one leaving listeners with the same chilling question: where is he now? The Zodiac's letters continued to arrive. They were both confession and challenge, taunting authorities while chilling the public. Some letters boasted of murders that could not be confirmed, creating a sense of omnipresence, that he was everywhere and nowhere at once. Others contained puzzles and ciphers, cryptic messages that teased the possibility of uncovering his identity, yet remained unsolved for decades. Each letter served as a reminder that he was intelligent, calculating, and utterly fearless. Psychological profiles were drawn up. Experts speculated on his age, occupation, habits, and personality. Was he a young man frustrated with society, a middle-aged loner, or something even more cunning? The more detectives studied his letters, the more a portrait emerged of a narcissistic mind, obsessed with control and recognition. He craved attention, yet remained invisible, a terrifying combination that made him impossible to predict. Media coverage further fueled the tension. Newspapers published his letters in full, dissecting each word and symbol. Radio shows debated his motives, crime enthusiasts speculated endlessly, and citizens pored over every detail, hoping to glean a clue. The Zodiac was, in effect, controlling the narrative, orchestrating fear and fascination simultaneously. The public had become both his audience and his prey. Even the smallest developments caused panic. A reported sighting of a man matching vague descriptions would send neighborhoods into lockdown. Police cars patrolled streets with renewed urgency, and ordinary citizens became amateur detectives, watching, waiting, and fearing the next attack. The line between vigilance and paranoia blurred as the killer maintained a constant, unrelenting presence in the collective consciousness. Amid all this, one of the most haunting aspects was his unpredictability. He struck without warning, at varying locations, at different times, and with no discernible pattern. Couples could be safe one night, yet at risk the next. Streets once considered ordinary and familiar became dangerous zones. The unpredictability magnified the fear, leaving citizens with a sense of helplessness. Anyone could be the next victim, and no precautions seemed sufficient. Law enforcement efforts became a grueling game of endurance. Stakeouts lasted for hours, sometimes days, with officers hoping to intercept him before he struck again. Yet each attack he carried out elsewhere mocked their vigilance. Each new crime scene, meticulously staged, underscored his intelligence and the chilling pleasure he seemed to derive from the hunt. This was not just killing, this was theater, executed with precision and a cold, calculated mind. Despite the fear, some moments of human courage shone through. Survivors recounted their narrow escapes with trembling voices, yet also spoke of the quick thinking that saved their lives. These moments gave the public a faint glimmer of hope that perhaps the Zodiac, for all his cunning, was not invincible. But the hope was always fragile, overshadowed by the knowledge that he could strike again at any time, leaving no warning, no evidence, and no remorse. By the end of this period, the Zodiac killer had become more than just a criminal. He was a symbol. He represented the fragility of safety, the unpredictability of evil, and the horrifying potential of a mind consumed by narcissism and cruelty. Northern California would never be the same. Streets, parks, and parking lots were no longer just public spaces. They had become arenas of fear, watched with suspicion, forever haunted by the invisible predator who could strike at any moment. And yet, for all the chaos, all the letters, all the puzzles and murders, the killer remained unseen. His identity was still a mystery, his motives a puzzle, and his next move unknown. The Zodiac had created a nightmare that extended far beyond his crimes into the psyche of every resident, every police officer, and every journalist who dared to follow the story. The cat-and-mouse game had reached its peak, leaving a trail of terror and unanswered questions in its wake. As Part 3 closes, the tension is palpable. The Zodiac has proven himself elusive, brilliant, and horrifyingly bold. The authorities are exhausted, the public is terrified, and the legend grows with each passing day. One question hangs in the air like a shadow over Northern California. How long can a man remain free while terrorizing an entire region, and will he ever be caught? By the mid-1970s, the Zodiac killer had vanished as mysteriously as he had arrived. For years, he had left a trail of death, cryptic messages, and terror, yet no one knew his identity. The fear he inspired did not fade with his disappearance. Instead, it lingered, a shadow over the towns and cities of Northern California. Residents still glanced nervously at strangers on the street. Teenagers hesitated to walk alone after dark, and families remembered the nights when news of yet another murder spread panic across the Bay Area. Even though he had stopped sending letters, the legend of the Zodiac continued to grow. Books were written, documentaries produced, and true crime enthusiasts obsessed over every detail. Each cipher's unsolved mystery became a puzzle for amateur codebreakers and professionals alike. Some believed that the Zodiac's identity might never be revealed, while others remained determined to uncover the truth. His letters, the eerie codes, and the chilling taunts had cemented his place in criminal history as one of America's most enigmatic and terrifying figures. Law enforcement continued to investigate even decades later. Cold cases were reopened, old evidence re-examined, and forensic techniques updated with modern technology. Fingerprints, DNA, handwriting analysis, and digital profiling became tools in a decades-long quest to finally identify him. Despite these advances, the Zodiac's true identity remained elusive. He had left behind no definitive trace that could lead to a capture, no signature that could be followed to its end. Every lead was a dead end, every theory an incomplete puzzle. The psychological impact on the public remained profound. Families who had lived through his reign of terror carried memories of sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the creeping paranoia that anyone could be a potential victim. Even those who had never encountered him directly were aware of the stories of letters containing twisted jokes, ciphers promising secrets, and murders committed with brutal efficiency. The Zodiac had rewritten the rules of fear, turning ordinary life into a landscape of uncertainty and dread. Cultural fascination with the Zodiac killer also flourished. Movies, books, and TV specials depicted him as both an enigma and a monster, exploring his psychology, his letters, and his crimes. True crime enthusiasts pored over every shred of information, dissecting the minutiae of his attacks, his writing, and his unsolved ciphers. The Zodiac became more than a killer. He became a symbol of the darkness lurking within humanity, the terror of the unknown, and the obsession with understanding evil. One of the most haunting aspects of his legacy is the unsolved ciphers. Cryptographers, both professional and amateur, attempted to crack the codes for decades. Some were partially solved, revealing cryptic messages, but the most famous cipher, the 340-character puzzle, remained unsolved for over 50 years. It taunted the world, a testament to the Zodiac's intellect, patience, and cruel sense of humor. Even in death or disappearance, he continued to play his game, challenging humanity to understand the mind of a murderer who had no remorse. Survivors' stories also contributed to the enduring legacy. Those who had escaped his attacks recounted moments of sheer terror, close calls, and the instinctual bravery that saved their lives. Their testimonies humanized the horror, reminding the public that behind the letters and ciphers were real people whose lives had been forever altered. These accounts preserved the reality of the Zodiac's reign of terror, making it more than just legend, more than just mystery. It was history written in fear. The killer's identity remains unknown, and perhaps that is part of the horror. He could have been a neighbor, a colleague, someone who blended seamlessly into everyday life, hiding behind a mask of normalcy. This uncertainty transformed him into a symbol of fear that transcended the actual crimes. Every unsolved case, every unanswered letter, every unbroken cipher extended his reach into the present, keeping the terror alive in the collective imagination. Authorities periodically revisited the case using modern techniques like DNA analysis and digital forensics to re-examine old evidence. New suspects emerged, some discredited, others under investigation. Yet the Zodiac continued to evade capture, reinforcing the myth of a predator who could strike without warning and disappear without a trace. The inability to definitively solve the case kept both professionals and the public obsessed, illustrating the profound and lasting impact of his crimes. Psychologists and criminologists often study the Zodiac case as an example of a methodical, narcissistic serial killer who understood the power of terror. His letters, his ciphers, and his taunts reveal a mind consumed with control, fame, and the thrill of the hunt. Unlike many other killers, he sought not only to murder, but to manipulate public perception, creating fear that extended far beyond the immediate victims. He understood that terror could be magnified through media, and he used it with terrifying effectiveness. The communities affected still remember. Residents speak of the nights when they would lock doors early, check over their shoulders, and avoid dark roads. The fear he instilled lingered, shaping behavior and leaving psychological scars that lasted decades. Even new generations learned of him as a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are invisible, unpredictable, and impossible to catch. In the broader scope of history, the Zodiac Killer represents a turning point in public awareness of serial crime. His actions demonstrated the vulnerabilities in law enforcement, the impact of media in spreading both information and fear, and the chilling realization that a single individual could terrorize an entire region. The letters, ciphers, and murders were not just isolated acts. They were lessons in human psychology, criminal methodology, and the pervasive nature of fear. As the story closes, the question remains unanswered. Who was the Zodiac? He may never be identified. He may have lived out his life in obscurity, never facing justice for his crimes. Yet his presence is still felt in the unsolved ciphers, in the stories of survivors, in the cautionary tales of parents and teenagers, and in the cultural fascination that persists to this day. He is a shadow over history, a phantom whose legend continues to haunt the collective imagination. Ultimately, the Zodiac Killer's legacy is not just measured in victims or letters. It is measured in fear, in obsession, and the unrelenting human drive to understand the incomprehensible. The unsolved mysteries, the cryptic ciphers, the stories of close escapes, and the unanswered questions have ensured that the Zodiac Killer remains one of the most notorious, enigmatic, and terrifying figures in American history. The phantom who terrorized California decades ago has left an indelible mark, a legacy of terror and mystery that refuses to fade. And so the legend endures. The Zodiac Killer may never be caught, may never be fully understood, yet his story continues to captivate, horrify, and haunt the collective imagination. Northern California, and indeed the world, remembers the terror he wrought and wonders, always, if the shadow of the Zodiac still lingers somewhere, unseen, waiting.